Welcome to the Scottish Jazz Archive interviews, Rob. And I thought I'd just ask to start with perhaps how you first got into jazz. What led you into it?
It might sound a bit weird, but through the television, when I would be at primary school, it seemed, looking back, it seemed to be quite a lot of music programs on the TV, despite the fact they had two channels. And my folks had a music shop, so there was no problem about, if I wanted to watch a music program on the TV, so would they, because they could see what instruments were being played, stuff. And I can remember Cleo Lane would be one of the first people I saw. And at this point, it would probably be trad bands. Although I can remember seeing the famous, I can't remember the name of the station, but I remember the famous Sister Rosetta Tharpe gig that ITV put on when she was playing on a railway station. And I thought, well, she can't be a nun. But she was amazing. And that kind of led me into, well, the other thing was Ready Steady Go also had like blues people on. Like you would see Nina Simone or John Lee Hooker on Ready Steady Go. So that all kind of appealed to me and led me to the portal, as I call him now, but Davy Graham, who had this album called Folk Blues and Beyond. And he was regarded, I suppose, as a folk blues guitar player, but he opened the door for me to all sorts of things, like Moroccan music, because he was playing world music before we had a term of world music. But he also led me to Monk, Mingus, Miles, Cannonball, Art Blakey, Bobby Timmons, because he was playing all that stuff. And you were probably the same yourself, but if you looked at the back of a record cover, you'd go, oh, okay, I need to check out this person. And you put it all together from there. And I suppose by the time I was in my mid-teens, I was listening to Miles and all sorts of things. Mingus was a big favorite of mine when I was about 16 or 17, and still is. But
And was this back in Dundee?
yeah,
Yeah. And was there
um,
much of a scene in Dundee?
there was music. In terms of a jazz scene, well, Jimmy Duker came back to Dundee about 1974, 75, and he was the kind of local hero, obviously, because he'd done all that stuff with Tubby Hayes and Ronnie Scott and stuff. So he had a regular gig on a Sunday, and there was a jazz club in the Queen's Hotel on a Sunday lunchtime as well. Actually, typical Dundee, there's two jazz gigs clashing on a Sunday lunchtime. And the university had a jazz club, which was kind of probably unlikely now. I'm not sure about university jazz clubs, but the University Jazz Club in Dundee, I remember, had John Sermon, the trio, and I skipped school because it was a lunchtime gig on a Friday. I remember going to see that, and the other one that I thought actually had imagined it, but there was a band called Mark Hammond, which has nothing to do with the pop singer who works with Jules Holland these days. But there was a band called Mark Hammond who had actually played with John Mayall. It was John Mark, Johnny Hammond, and they formed their own band, Mark Hammond. And on one tour, they had Danny Richmond on drums. And for quite a long time, I thought I'd made that up. Did I see Danny Richmond with Mark Hammond? But recently on Twitter, there's a guy been tweeting these old adverts and articles from Melody Maker. Quite a lot of it's prog rock and maybe even just rock that I'm not particularly interested in, but he's obviously a bit of a jazz fan as well. You'll find out about Nucleus's early gigs and all this kind of stuff, and what's on at Ronnie Scott's. And he had this article from Melody Maker about Mark Hammond. Sure enough, Danny Richmond toured with Mark Hammond when I thought he had. I'd been about 50 at school at the time. So all that kind of led me into, I was doing a bit of playing, but as far as being a musician is concerned, I think that being a musician, my contribution would be that being a musician showed me what musicians needed for a gig. So if I booked someone, I knew what they would need, basically. So round about 1979, Roger Spence had been employed by Platform to set up or take Platform forward. And I also knew Bill Kyle about this time. And I got involved in the Platform branch in Dundee and helped to set it up. And we put on all sorts of things. Gosh. George Coleman was an early... George Coleman with Billy Higgins on drums is an early memory. Bands like Morrissey and Mullen, we put on Billy Cobham, we had Jan Hammer, Dudu Pukwana. We were meant to do 6 concerts a year because we got this grant from the Arts Council. We ended up doing quite a bit more than that, I seem to remember. I could probably rattle off more names if I could think of them. Alan Holdsworth is another one. Jack Bruce. We did Jack Bruce's 40th birthday concert in Dundee, which was quite a coup.
And when did you move to Edinburgh then?
I moved to London first.
Okay.
After about 5 years running Platform, I got offered the job with Jazz Services as their tour coordinator, which was the job title, but the job description was a bit wider than that. I was kind of the press officer, and we also organised the Schlitz Young Jazz Musician of the Year competition, which I stage managed. I've got a vivid memory of crawling about the floor of Heaven in London because the band actually won it, but they were a saxophone quartet, Itchy Fingers, and they came to me and said, "We want to process through the audience. How do we do that?" And I said, "I'll make that work." And I crawled in front of them and sort of patted women on the bum to get them onto the stage right through the auditorium. So that was another thing. We also ran 6 weeks of concerts in Embankment Gardens in the summer, which was very amusing at times. Tommy Chase was involved in that. I look back at the Tommy Chase gig as the Battle of Tommy Chase. But a couple of other things that happened there were Chris McGregor sat in with this George Lee's band. And George Lee was a South African saxophone player. Could never understand why I kept telling him, your band's not going to work in Glasgow, George. Why not? Why not? Because, well, George Lee's Anansi is not really marketable in Glasgow. But I put him on at the Embankment Gardens, and Chris McGregor turned up and played flute because it was Mervyn Africa's gig. Mervyn Africa's a great piano player, and Chris elbowed Mervyn off the piano stool, so to speak. So that was amusing. I always remember Dick Morrissey. His quartet were doing a gig, and I woke up that morning, it was absolutely bucketing. I thought, gig's not going to happen. Got to the office, we were in Covent Garden, so not far from Embankment Gardens. Got to the office, I thought, this gig's not going to happen. I tried to phone Dick, this is before mobile phones, but he'd obviously set out for Embankment Gardens, and I got down there, and here's the 4 of them, sheltering from the rain. I said, "Listen, guys, I'll pay you, you don't have to play." And they said, "Don't be ridiculous, we were playing." And they played for an hour, and every song had rain in the title. I think it's going to rain today, here's that rainy day. Well, you know the rest. So I did that. I also ran tours by Keith Tippett and John Sermon and Backdoor, Bobby Watson, Bobby Wellens, Jim Mullen, Ian Bellamy, many others, Elaine Del Mar, the Pizza Express All-Stars, which had Duncan Lamont on. They call him Duncan Lamont in London, but I call him Duncan Lamont. But I didn't know that Duncan Lamont was writing songs that were being sung by Natalie Cole in those days. I thought it was a sax player from Greenock. So I did that for about 3 years, then I came back to work for Platform in Edinburgh.
So what year would that have been then, Rob?
I came back in '87.
I see. Yeah, no, we've done quite a lot of work on trying to piece together the platform years, and
Mhm.
it is a kind of heyday of activity up in Scotland.
I think that's down to Bill Kyle, first of all, who had the kind of there were obviously things like the Black Bull and other pockets of jazz activity going on, but Bill, I think, was the guy who wanted these heroes to come and play in Scotland, and his heroes were a generation younger than the people Black Bull would book. Um, in fact, it wasn't a platform gig, but I remember when Bill had the original British Jazz Bar, he had Lenny White borrowed Bill's kit to play a gig with Buster Williams, and Bill was just absolutely that was Christmas Day as far as Bill was concerned. That was the sort of thing he wanted to. That's why he set up or helped set up Platform in the first place, to get guys like that to come and play in Scotland. And I think Bill was responsible for kind of instilling a kind of ambition in the younger promoters to get that sort of thing happening. And of course, when Roger came in to work for Platform, he was very much of the, let's get these guys across here. And he would encourage you to book Billy Cobham, Jan Hammer.
And I guess it was such an important thing because I mean it influenced all of the Scottish scene.
Well, they all got to see the people they were listening to on record. When I met Roger, he was a student at St Andrews, and he was very much of the let's get Eberhard Weber across here, and he did. Roger, as a student, I remember booked Eberhard Weber's Colours for St Andrews Music Festival, or St Andrews Festival, but that gig actually happened. And that, when he joined Platform, that's what he was wanting to do. Get the people who you were listening to actually playing on the Queen's Hall stage, or something like Colton Studios or the Third Eye Centre. And there were, 6 or 7 branches of Platform. Most, not all with the same kind of musical tastes. Inverness would have been more like Nairn became, with Lackey Shaw and Jim Love. They were more into mainstream, I guess. But Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, and Glasgow were of the kind of, if an ECM artist was available, that would be 4 dates, put it that way. But there was also one in the Borders, Alan Anderson was involved in, and probably on a smaller scale certainly on a smaller scale in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And there was a kind of satellite of Platform. I'm not sure if it was a branch of Platform, but there was something happened on a Wednesday night in Kirkcaldy for a while. And I can remember John McLeavy, who's one of the great Scottish, Scotland's produced a lot of trumpeters. I mentioned Jimmy Duker, but Johnny McLeavy is another one, and also from Dundee. When Johnny toured with Benny Goodman, and he also made about 50 albums with Max Bygraves, but he toured with Benny Goodman, and that in itself is great. But it turns out, and we can't actually corroborate this, but there's a good chance that Johnny's dad played with Louis Armstrong when Louis Armstrong came to Scotland in the 30s and played in Dundee, because Johnny's dad was a trumpeter in Dundee. So all that was going on in the sort of late 70s into the mid 80s.
And were you a journalist through this period, or is that something
No,
that came later?
When I was at school, I wanted to become a journalist, and one of my best friends became a journalist, which was quite amusing. But when I worked for Jazz Services, I really enjoyed the kind of scribbling press releases and that kind of thing. And after about 15 months, Platform got into financial difficulties, and I was on the dole for the first time in my life. And I thought, well, this is maybe a time to do something I really want to do. And I managed to get into the Herald, writing reviews, and they didn't tell me to stop until quite recently. I kind of trained on the job, really. I I started reviewing, and I got asked to do features, and ended up writing for the features department, like the women's page and all sorts of things. And that went on for about 30 years, slightly more.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting shift from from gatekeeper, or I was going to say gamekeeper to poacher, or poacher to gamekeeper. I don't know which way around that is. Um, um, I mean, in those 30 years, what what I'd like you to think about is what have been the sort of big changes that you've seen over that period? Because I mean, I guess there have been many.
Yeah, the festival, Glasgow Jazz Festival, had started not long before. I think that was '87. So I didn't review the first one. I probably didn't review the second one either. I can't really remember. But Glasgow Jazz Festival coming in and kind of filling in quite a lot of gaps of people who hadn't played in Scotland suddenly played in Scotland, like Mike Brecker and Elvin Jones, and you just need to look back at the Glasgow Jazz Festival programs. You could see I think everyone you wanted to see has now played in Scotland due to Glasgow Jazz Festival, or the sort of more recent version of Edinburgh Jazz Festival. Edinburgh Jazz Festival, to begin with, was a kind of pubs, and mainstream and trad. But when it merged with Roger's organisation, it became the kind of ambitious place where you'd see John McLaughlin or Mike Stern or John Schofield. So the festival's coming in, but in terms of the Scottish jazz scene, I think what the big changes are just more musicians. I mean, in the past, I think Tommy was always very keen to emphasise the fact that Scotland had produced jazz musicians of considerable ability, and they all went south. Bobby Wells, Tommy Whittle, John McLeavy, Jimmy Duker, they all had to leave. They all went to London. Whereas over the past 30 years, it's been possible for jazz musicians to stay in Scotland and to play in Scotland. You could now, it hasn't been done, but or has been done to some degree, but you could now run a touring operation with Scottish musicians in Scotland. Like you wouldn't have to import musicians. Well, you probably want to, but you could do it without importing musicians from outside. And I think Islay Jazz Festival shows that you can put on a festival which is almost entirely Scottish. So the musicians have stayed here, and I think the quality of musicianship has just got frightening, which I'd probably put down to Tommy's course at the RCS. It certainly had a major input. Even just it brings in like 7 musicians a year, and it's now putting out 7 musicians a year, and these people are staggeringly good, I think. So the standard of this local scene is, for me, it's kind of a standard that we used to see in Scandinavia. But when the ECM records thing came in, we were suddenly sort of exposed to all these great players, Arl Anderson and Garbrek and Daria Ripdahl, all that, Bobo Stenson, all that stuff. I'm thinking that it wouldn't be impossible were Keith Jarrett to come and form a Scottish quartet, as he did the Scandinavian quartet. He could find the musicians to work with here. I'm not sure that would have been the case in the 70s when that quartet was being formed, but just the quality is quite amazing.
And it's a sad thing then, I suppose, in a way, that there seems to be less places to play now than perhaps there were in the 70s. I mean, with the Platform Network, at least there was kind of a touring network in a way, and I remember like in the 80s there was jazz at the Queen's Hall every weekend pretty much.
Every Friday, I think Queen's Hall had jazz every Friday for 30 weeks of the year, from about, well, that was a platform initiative, probably from about 1981 through to the mid-90s. But the Queen's Hall gigs were mostly imported musicians, obviously, and there were a lot of people you could bring in on a Friday. Actually, Kurt Elling is interesting, because Kurt Elling studied at Edinburgh University for a year, and he went to the Queen's Hall. That's the first time he heard Tommy, was at the Queen's Hall as a student. And I spoke to him about this, and he rattled off the things he'd seen. It was like Don Cherry, and I think Larry Coryell was one. For a while, I think it got to the stage where there weren't the attractions that could do business in the Queen's Hall. If you look back at the sort of 80s through to the early 90s, there was something every weekend, as you say, that people went there. I've met people who went to the Queen's Hall on a Friday and didn't necessarily know what they were going to see. They just trusted it would be good, and they trusted it would be somebody with a real reputation. Someone who's they might have to buy 10 albums after the concert because they liked it so much.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose there was more press coverage back then as well of jazz, so it probably helped to build an audience.
The Scotsman was always good, and I guess the Herald. Before I went into the Herald, there was jazz in the Herald. Kenny Matheson wrote for the Herald at times, and Elliot Meadow wrote for the Herald. So there were more sort of outlets, but at the same time there weren't the websites that we have now. Maybe not so much in Scotland. There are several, but if you want to get the word out about something you're doing in the UK, you send information to they get called blogs. I think it's rather derogatory actually to call them a blog, because they're very supportive. If you look at Bebop Spoken Here, which is run in Newcastle, or the Jazz Man, which is in Hereford, London Jazz News is like a serious website for information about. It's not about London jazz. Well, it is, but it's about a lot more than London jazz. And that network didn't exist. That network's kind of filled a gap. Because I suppose local newspapers don't really cover jazz very much. When I was writing for the Courier until quite recently, we would, if there were jazz gigs happening, we would mention them in the Courier, which is interesting because when I promoted jazz in Dundee, you couldn't get anything in the paper. If you phoned the Courier and said, got this really good saxophone player coming from the States, they would say, well, why don't you advertise the gig? Whereas now they'll actually accept a press release and put something in the weekend section. Or that's what they were doing until all this happened.
And if you think back on all of those years, have you got any sort of standout memories?
Lots. One I like to tell people about is, I don't know if you know the band Om from Switzerland. We got them in Dundee. I think they probably played, I know they played Aberdeen as well. I think they probably played Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee. I thought they were great, but I knew them. I knew where they were. And when we put them on in Dundee, I'd be astonished if there were more than 6 people in town who knew who Om were. But they had rather good posters, I seem to remember. And we probably thought we were going to get, maybe if we got 50 people for Om, we thought that would be okay. We got about 300. Don't know what we did right. And nowadays you would get these 300 people's email addresses, but back then we didn't have that facility. So there were kind of amazing successes like that. But for the Herald, I was probably writing 250 concert reviews a year. And if you add in the Fringe, 300 reviews a year. It's actually quite difficult now to wade through all that and come up with highlights, because it's just a sort of a mess of gigs.